Welcome to the podcast. I'm very excited. My good friend James Loveday is here, and he is probably the biggest marketing brain in the NDIS, and I'm very glad to have him. James, why are you sitting here on this very comfy looking couch having a chat with me today?
I'm probably sitting on this couch, less to do with marketing. Well, more to do with it. I guess it is marketing. I just really want to talk about the way in which NDI service providers access events and how we learn from those events and what kind of events we should be accessing.
I think that's great because I'm seeing a lot of people waste their time lately going to events that aren't going to work.
Mm.
So what would you recommend for, say, a BDM, for a managing director, or for someone who's just starting out? What sort of events are time well spent?
I think that we need to be accessing these general NDIS networking events and stuff like that, because that's kind of our far now. That's our family, that's our group of people. But we also need to be looking a bit more internally into our organizations and starting to attend events that are really about upskilling our management staff and upskilling our organization and trying to learn about systems outside of the NDIS system. So we can really work out what that interface is between multiple systems. So yeah, that's what I think.
So that's
and
building for the long term.
Yeah, it's building for the long term. It's also a bit more. So I attended an event, an AOD event, earlier this year, because the company I'm now working for supports quite a few participants with addiction issues. So I attended an addiction event, and we were the only NDI service provider there, which I found really interesting because I know lots of NDI service providers that work in this kind of dual diagnosis space, which might have some overlay of addiction. And so we didn't go there saying we're an NDI service provider, give us referrals, but we did go there to learn from people. So, we got to meet the head of psych services for very, very large psychiatric hospitals. We got to meet different people that worked in different kind of rehab settings, because our participants are going to have an interface with that. They're going to have interaction with that. And we need to understand that better so that we can support them within it. So it's not an us and them. It's not, us, the NDIS versus the public system. And it was just really good to have one of the really good points there was and I'd never thought about this, but in the addiction world, they have lived experience workers. And I left from it going, we really need to think about how we support our staff better. Because a lot of our staff are in this industry because they're really passionate. They might have had a family member. They might have dabbled in having a mental health situation in their past. And we don't really ever look at that, but our staff are our key contributors to our participants. Where I sit as a CEO in a company, I don't see the participants every day. My staff does. So we really have to focus on how we support those staff and how we looked at what their experiences are and how we help them work through those experiences. And so it was just amazing going to a conference that wasn't just about price guides and, how we support people and billing. It was actually about how we interface between different organizations and different sectors.
That's remarkable, James. And it's like, because what you're talking about is long term. In the long term, we need more skill. In the short term, we need a referral. In the long term, we actually need skills so that we can handle the next 200 referrals. I love how you think. And James, I'm aware that a little birdie might have told me that you are actually leading something that is a combination of like right at that middle point between where neurodiversity meets mental health. And oh my goodness, this is exciting. What's the story and what is this rumor I'm hearing and how can we learn from you here?
So I've been asked to be the kind of national ambassador for the Neurodivergence conference on the Gold Coast in August later this year. And so that it's kind of a conference between the interface between neurodiversity and mental health, and that conversation around the amount of mental health that people with neurodiversity hold. And so I've been asked to be that. And I think the reasoning I've been asked is for two reasons. One, I do have a relatively good social media presence, which, does work for someone that's asked to be a national ambassador. But I also have that lived experience around being someone that is neurodiverse and really having some times in my life where I've been I've had some very, very bad mental health because of that. And some of the, I guess when you're someone with neurodiversity, you learn to mask. So within that masking, you actually, you deal with mental health by yourself. You really don't pass it on to other people like someone that's someone that's neurotypical might. So I think that's one of the reasons they've asked me.
So that makes so much sense. Now, you and I know what we're talking about here. Let's pull back a bit and be like, right, let's imagine if someone's a BDM, they've been that for a year and a half, or they're a managing director of something, say SIL. When you're talking about, there's a massive, massive intersection between mental health, complex mental health and neurodiversity. Enormous. And there's no amount of band-aiding you can do to solve that. And then when you're like, when someone is in that spot of their brain works in a neurodiverse way and they're having a hard season, really hard season, then the tendency is to mask, is to hide, is just to put on the best face and hope the world just doesn't ask too many questions. Can you talk us through what we can learn from you here and talk us through what you wish everyone knew about this? Because there's not a single person listening to this podcast who doesn't need to know this stuff.
I think so. I'll go to some of the challenges I've had over my probably life and career in relation to being neurodiverse, and understanding I've been working in the disability sector for 25 odd years. So when I was a teenager, I had a lot of adult friends. I really sought a lot of conversation. And when I was in high school, I saw that university was going to be my saving grace, that all of that childishness and all of that superficialness would be gone. And when I went to uni to study, it was probably the biggest mental health concern I ever had in my life, because I'd set myself up to fail because I believed that university was going to be my savior. And it really led me to be, at that time in my life, I became suicidal. So it wasn't very good. And when I worked through that, those kind of that suicidal component, it also then led to I've had a heavy amount of drug addiction and drinking addiction in my past. But now in hindsight, I would see that a lot of that was me seeking, because I wanted deeper conversation with people. I wanted to actually understand stuff, because when you're someone that's neurodiverse, you are always on the search for understanding. I want to understand how something works. I want to understand how things interact with each other. And in, when you're in your early 20s, that's not what life's about. It's not about understanding. It's about partying and stuff like that. So the way I was able to interact with the partying and that socialization was by being heavily intoxicated and doing substances, because that actually led to really unjudgmental conversation, where I could sit down on a couch and have a deep dive conversation with someone. So my neurodiversity led me to mental health. It led me to drug addiction, just because I was seeking answers and seeking conversation. When I went into the support work realm, because I didn't gel well with other support workers, and I admit that, I was very much a sole trader as a support worker. I was doing amazing, amazing work because of my understanding of neurodiversity, my understanding of mental health, and me really wanting to get to the bottom of why someone needed the supports they needed. But I was also totally marginalized by the rest of the support workers, because when we worked in a day service, all of the other support workers would catch up for Friday. I was never, ever invited, ever, to something like that. I was never, ever invited within those social settings, within my peers. I was just seen as the guy that got outcomes with participants, and they didn't understand how I was getting those outcomes, and they didn't understand how I thought and how I acted on things. So I was constantly just pushed aside from my peers, and that had a lot of it put a lot of stress on me, because I had to do everything myself. Every idea I had about a participant was mine, which is great to own how you work. But at the same time, I really had no other support workers. I had a very few support workers to lean on around the complexity of the participants that I worked with. And that leads to more mental health. because when you're working with people with neurodiversity, you're working with people with mental health, you're working with people with complex trauma, you do take some of that on. And when you're someone that has that is quite neurodiverse themselves, and you're very good at masking, you can take that on and no one ever sees it. So, and then, later on having to learn how to allow people to see that, I guess, so that it kind of lowers the level of mental health around.
This is so helpful. So obviously whoever's halfway through this podcast, they're not switching off. Let's look at this. Long story short, James, you're letting us into your world and we appreciate that. Okay. So, and what you're saying is there's a lot of people out there or in here, they could be anywhere. They could be sitting beside you at work. They look like they've got their crap together. And to be honest, inside, they're just stuck. They don't know how to be unstuck. They know that to get by, they have to look unstuck even though they're not. And you're talking about a couple of issues here. One is the extreme isolation of that. The other is the fact that you get locked into that, you can't get out. And then you end up using like less resourceful strategies like being intoxicated or drug addiction or whatever to try to just get through that day, to try to just get through that situation. And you're saying at this intersection between neurodiversity and mental health, there's a whole realm here that no one wants to touch, no one wants to talk about. It's much more convenient to just assume that of your 50 support workers, 5 of them are not living there when they damn well are. So how can we learn from this experience you went through so that others don't have to stay stuck? How do we learn as friends? How do we learn as family members? How do we learn in the workplace? What can we learn from your experience here?
I think I still see this now, especially in the kind of business development world of community service organizations, is that there's a lot of judgment put on to other people and how they work and why they do things. And I think it's not judgment. I think it's true lack of education of how people operate. So I think one of the things we really need to do is, and I'm not saying we're judgmental, but we need to really, that difference between perspective and, perspective and, I can't remember. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to go down that bandwidth because I can't remember the second word. But basically, we really need to look at it from someone else's shoes. So one of the things, I used to work for a large organization that specialized in working with people with mental health. And I worked in a managerial position. And I can tell you, it was the hardest place I ever worked, because even though this organization was very proactive around supporting people with mental health, internally within the office, we had very, very little understanding and little tolerance for people with mental health and neurodiversity. We were so kind of siloed within our own jobs and our own person that it was very, very hard to see how other people dealt with things. And I think that's really what we need to do. When someone does something that we see as not normal, that's because it's not normal for us. It doesn't mean it's not normal for them. And when we ostracize that person or judge them, we're actually pushing them further away and we're getting less understanding. And I feel like the world needs to become more understanding. Like, I have a lot of, in the past, I've worked with a lot of BDs that have been training up to be super BDs and super strategists. And the first thing they do is they compare themselves to their mentor. So if I'm their mentor, they're comparing themselves to me, but they're not me. They don't have the same experiences as me. They don't have the same, the quirks as me. They don't have the same education as me, or lack of education as me. So you can't compare yourself to someone, because all it does is put you on the back foot. Like, I meet people, I'm working with a lady at the moment, and one of the things I've said to her when I'm training her up to BD stuff is, don't be me, be you. I will always, you are in this position because you are you, not because you are me. And the different organizations and different people need different skill sets within that same job title. I used to work for very, very big BD teams, and everyone in that team had a totally different approach. And that works. We can't all be the same person. So we really have to have a better understanding of the people we're working with and be less judgmental. And when someone goes, hey, why is that person doing that? Go, well, they're doing it because of this. Or, I guess as community service organizations, sometimes we've actually lost the understanding of what community is and what understanding is. I think we've really become quite insular. And I think we also see it from like organizational. I'm always talking about understanding where you sit within the NDIS world. So where your organization sits. And I think that one of the really important things is when you understand where you sit, you also understand where other organizations sit. So I now work for an organization that specializes in working with people that are ambulant. We only have one non-ambulant participant within our whole cohort of participants. And we specialize in people with that intersection between neurodiversity, mental health, AOD, acquired brain injury. So that's what we work with. So that's what
and which is that organization?
Oh, they're called T&K Support Services, and we're based between the other. So we're called T&K, but the other thing is we also know that because we work in that space, we are only servicing the space that we can service. So we also geographically we service regional Victoria, because regional Western Victoria, because we also know that that's a different approach to the city, and we're not a city organization; we're a country organization. But what that means is when we understand who we are, when we understand who we are, we also then understand if someone comes in and they're not the right fit for us, we should understand who is the right fit. That organization over there would be amazing to support you because, yes, you have some form of acquired brain injury, but you grew up in the middle of Melbourne and you're in a wheelchair. So we're not the right organization for you. You can have us if you really, really want us, but we're probably not got the complete understanding. So one of the, this is my tagline for a while has been, let's navigate this. And I feel like it has been very broad, but my new tagline is identity before diagnosis. We have to look at who the person is and how we're going to support the person before we even think about what the diagnosis is. And I think we need to look at the same with our staff, with our support workers, with the organizations we work with. What is their identity before what is the technicality of them? So, yeah.
That makes so much sense. And I'm excited because you are so clear about what T&K does, and you're so clear about what they don't do. And then you're proactive in knowing, all right, who can we send people to? And that's no different to say, and there's no excuse for any of us not being that. So if I'm working with someone, say, and they're a brand new provider and they want a website done, I will often send them to Greg Chadwick at the Gold Coast because he's just amazing at coaching brand new providers. If I'm talking to an organization and they're huge and they want Facebook ads and Google ads and boring crap like that, I'll send them to Chris Lapper, L-A-P-A, Chris Lapper, and he'll sort them. And then there's plenty of people who I'm built for. And there's no excuse for any of us not knowing who to send people to because that's called helping. And I understand what you're saying with that. And I can hear what you're saying of, like, there is a whole world out there of people who are stuck, and they're stuck because we're looking at KPIs, not what this person needs. Now, as NDIS squeezes more and more profitability, I don't see how it's going to go any other way, that we're going to keep looking more at KPIs than people. But if we just rewind a bit, back when you're describing that hard time that you went through at uni, let's imagine that 40-year-old James, or however old you have to be to have a beard as good as yours, is sitting down at his workplace next to 20-something-year-old James. And let's imagine you're looking at this like 20-year-old James, and day after day you're seeing what he's dealing with. And let's just assume for a moment you have your current level of knowledge. What sort of factors would be going through your head when you're seeing young James? What sort of questions might you be asking him? What sort of ways would you have of supporting him? What could you have done for young James had you been there?
So it's more about understanding. I don't think it's always about us having the conversation. It's about, I really like the word ecosystem. And I think that when someone's struggling, the best thing to do is to build an ecosystem around them. Otherwise, they will go source an ecosystem. And an ecosystem can be a beautiful, forest, or an ecosystem can be a junk tip. You know what I mean? They're both ecosystems.
That makes sense. How would you set up for the 20-year-old version of you an ecosystem that would actually support him through that season?
I think I did. I think the ecosystem. So I think I don't ever look at my past and say I was hard done by or it was bad. I just think that's what's built me to what I am today. When I was 20, I think what saved me was I moved to Alice Springs when I was 20. So I lived in the same place for a long period of time with the same people. And I moved to Alice Springs just because a family member invited me to go for a drive, and I ended up staying in Alice Springs. But because I was outside of my comfort zone and outside of my kind of friends base and family, it kind of forced me a little bit to be more of an adult, I guess. But it also forced me to live with a whole bunch of other people that were in the same situation no matter what age they were. Everyone was new. Everyone was trying to find themselves. And so that was the ecosystem I built around myself. But it also meant, because there was lots of people, it was like, I've always dreamt of owning a caravan park. And it's not because I want to own a caravan park. I could think of nothing worse than managing a caravan park. And I'm probably the worst caravan park manager ever. But building that ecosystem of being able to speak with new people every day about what they're passionate about, what they're interested in. So what would have I done when I was 20? If I had to stay where I was and I didn't end up in Alice Springs, I probably, what have I done? I probably would have started doing drugs a lot earlier in life, to tell you the truth. That's what I would have done. What the organizations around me could have done is, I don't know, to tell you the truth, because I don't think that the organizations that I was working with were doing anything wrong. I don't think that they tried to support me to the best of their abilities. I think that a lot of it had to do with how I felt and what I was willing to give up. So if I was looking at my 20-year-old self, I'd probably say, be more open with who you are, not just try to get into deep and meaningful conversations with people, but explain to people how not so much about what you're interested in, but how you feel about something. It's probably the difference between interest and feeling. So yeah.
That makes sense. And let's imagine if for some reason you were going on an 8-hour road trip with young 20-year-old James. In that road trip, you'd talk a lot about nothing, because that's how road trips work. But there would be a few key things that you would impart to 20-year-old James. One of them would be what you just said of, mate, you got to be real with people about what's actually going on in your head, how you feel about stuff. What else would you want him to know? Because if we're going to talk about the intersection between neurodiversity and mental health, what is it people need to know to feel like they're allowed to be them? They're allowed, that they're not actually broken and that their life is not off track. This is a speed bump, mate. This is not the end of the road, sort of thing. What would you communicate to him?
I love driving. When I was a support worker, I loved driving with the participants, but not for the purpose of driving, but for the purpose of deeper conversation. I love road trips for that purpose. What would I say? I don't know. I would probably come through music, to tell you the truth. And what's being played on the radio. So I had a child, when I say child, a 14 or 15-year-old I was working with at one stage, and he was very, very angry. And so after school, I used to pick him up and we used to play like extreme heavy metal, loud music. And we did it for weeks. And we were doing it to kind of release some pressure from him. It was great. But then one day he was having an okay day, and he said to me, because he was like semi-goth and like into heavy metal music. He was kind of rebelling. That's who he was at that stage in his life. And I hated heavy. That's not I like music where you can hear the words. And I would say, I don't really like this song, but we'd scream it in the car for his purposes. And then one day he turned around to me and he said, James, I've chosen a song for you. And I was like, okay, this is going to be something I particularly probably don't like, but that's all right. And he chose a song called Shotgun by Luke Ezra, I think it is. And it's this kind of country song about sitting in a car with someone else and just riding shotgun, just being present. And I went, oh, this is really interesting, because we spent a lot of time in a car. I said, is that what this is about? And he goes, no, James, I'm autistic, and the way you sing is absolutely terrible. and this song does not take any skill to sing it. And I was like, you know what, that was an amazing conversation because it showed that we both understood each other. And I think that when you're on a road trip with someone, the conversation that you have normally repels around music or you hear something on the radio and then you relate back to that. And it's kind of you have deep and meaningful conversation that comes from a very shallow area. And I think that is really great about road trips. And I think that I did a lot of road tripping and a lot of driving. I didn't get my driver's license until I was 30. And I was always the person in the passenger seat, keeping the driver awake. Because, I'm very good at staying awake. I think that, it's that conversation. I loved it. So, yeah, it's really interesting you asked about road trips because I absolutely love road tripping. So,
Okay.
yeah.
That is just fantastic. Okay, so here's what goes through my head. If you're national ambassador for basically looking at a way that we can help people who are neurodivergent to actually get past the masking and start being them, and putting that in context with people for whom that terminology is just annoying, masking is when I bring to the table what I think you want me to do. That's masking.
So,
How do we... Yeah. This, James, you would know 100 better explanations, but that's like the roughest I can come up with. So it's like, James, how do we create a space, a workplace, a home, a friendship space, a youth group? How do we create a space where someone who's had a hard time at school, they were escalated, being neurodivergent is not easy for 6 hours at school. How do you create a space where someone in that shoes on a hard day is able to actually be valued for who they are, not judged, to feel invited to the table? How do we do that?
I hate sport, but I love the idea that it brings people with different interests to the table. I was always in the theatre, and I loved that when we did youth theatre that I would meet a lot of people that had different upbringings that were all had a common interest. I think the best way of working and understanding and that kind of, and stop people from masking is to find a common interest between a whole bunch of different people. I worked in Alice Springs at one stage in a high school, and teachers like lunchroom in a high school is probably the most interesting thing you've ever been in. I don't know if you were a primary school teacher or a high school teacher. Were you, Michael? Which one?
I used to be a primary school teacher, and I used to hide from the staff room because I didn't have anything in common with most people there. Yeah, I understand.
A high school staff room is a whole bunch of people that have nothing in common other than they like teaching children. And so I used to sit in that room and just watch how the teachers interacted with each other. And it was absolutely amazing because, so I think when you find a common goal, so they talk a lot about men and mental health around, it's really hard to have a conversation with a man about mental health unless you're doing something else. So you'll see a lot of men's-based programs will be based around fixing a car. You have a common interest, which is fixing the car. The conversation is secondary. It might be around cooking. We talk about, in European families, we talk about the conversation that happens around cooking. The common interest is cooking. The mental health and the learning is actually done just as a residual. And I think that we really have to think about that. What is that residual outcome? It's not always the direct outcome. Fixing a car, cooking a meal, painting a house is not only because one of my friends I painted a house with and we had the biggest DM I've ever had in my life with someone. But was the mental health and the neurodiversity in the conversation was a secondary. And I think that's really what we need to look at is approaching it as this is a secondary if we have a common goal.
That makes sense. And if I was a support worker and I just heard that conversation, I'd be like, right, let's get our young guys out there, walking through town, just doing life, getting bored together, and let those conversations happen as a secondary thing. Good call.
We used to, when I was a support worker for you go. Sorry, Michael, say that again.
No, you go. There was just a glitch there on the recording. I said, what else would you want to see in terms of training people up, or where does that lead for Like, what are your thoughts?
I think that if I could train any support worker in anything, I would say stop seeing your car as a vehicle to get people from point to point and start seeing it as a toolbox. Because when you're in a car, you're in a quite an intimate conversation with someone, so you can have quite good conversation. But what I also mean by toolbox is that I've worked a lot with youth, I've worked a lot with mental health, young adults, and you spend a lot of time in the community. And a lot of what affects people's mental health and leads them to criminality and leads to overwhelmingness within their neurodiversity is kind of a boredom and a lack of knowing what to do. So when I say use your car as a toolbox, I used to have a car, and in my boot was everything and anything that could be used based on that person. So I don't like sport, but I always had a football or a basketball. So we could go play basketball. I had a cajon, which is like a drum you sit on and play. I had I'm used to do circus, so I had juggling stuff. So I always had tools to work with the person. So I wasn't after school, I wasn't picking them up and going, hey, let's go have a picnic and sit down. They don't want a picnic. Hey, let's go shoot some hoops. And when we shoot those hoops, we'll talk about what your day was like at school. You know what I mean? You'll know as a teacher that sometimes the best conversations you have with your students is at lunchtime, when you're just kind of having a peer-to-peer conversation. There's no hierarchy. It's just, hey, we're sharing space and this conversation's happening, and that's where the learning happens. So I think a lot of support workers have to understand that being passive in someone's space, yet interacting with them, is sometimes the best place to be in.
Yeah, and you're also conveying that you actually care about someone, or you wouldn't be throwing in basketball at a hoop.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense. James, tell me, I've just got to ask, what's your view on KPIs? Because right now, I'm seeing people watching their KPIs go through the roof. So and the context of this is, obviously I teach a LinkedIn course. A lot of the BDMs coming to me are because their KPIs are suddenly unachievable. What's your view on KPIs?
The KPIs are unachievable. And the reasoning behind that is someone that's been in the sector for a long period of time, is that your KPIs are based on 5 years ago when there was growth in the scheme. So 5 years ago, so the scheme's 11 years old. So we had people coming onto the scheme and numbers were getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Those numbers are capped. We're at capacity with those numbers. So most of those people have support already. So how do you grow KPIs when the scheme isn't growing? The numbers base isn't growing. I think that KPIs are pointless because they're not achievable. And the only way to achieve them is actually through poaching and taking participants from other providers, which is kind of contradictory to us talking about working with each other. Because if someone's already got, so say someone's in a still house, right? And your KPI is to get someone for your still house, there's a good chance they're already in a still house. So you're stealing. You're not stealing, the word's not, do you get what I mean? Like, we're not in a growth phase. So why is there heavy KPIs? I think that the phase we should be in, our KPIs should be around keeping participants in our companies, not around growing our companies. So we should have KPIs around quality services. Because the other thing is, if we have quality services, our organizations will naturally grow. Because we're already known. It's not like we're new. We've been, So I think KPIs, so BDs who have KPIs about growth, it's really, really hard because there is no growth at the moment. The only way to grow is to, there are growth niche areas within the NDIS at the moment, but that's within the really, really complex areas. And a lot of organizations aren't set up to do really, really complex stuff. That's not what their backgrounds are, not what their management structures allow them to do. So I think when it comes to KPIs, the KPI should be around retention and good service, not around growth, because with retention and good service, the businesses will naturally grow.
That makes so much sense.
Okay.
Here's another question, James. I'm watching our industry break apart at the seams in some areas, and I'm watching people lose their crap over things they can't control, and that hurts me. If we're going to lose our crap over something, it would want to be something that's in our control. What's going through your head with what the impact of the new price guide is going to be on the industry that you and I both love?
What's going through my head? I understand that it's scary for a lot of people, this new price guide. I understand it. But I've also taken a step back and I wonder why the price guide is the way it is. There would be reasoning behind it. They're not just going to say, hey, we're not going to pay you this. So the biggest really, so obviously support coordination, no movement, allied health, weird movement in weird directions. And then support workers, very static. Okay. I'm going to talk to support coordination probably first. I know people that own support coordination businesses that are not worried about the price guide in any way whatsoever, because they've built their businesses not to make profit, but to make a livable wage for themselves. So as they've scaled up with support coordinators, their profit margin has slightly grown, but they're not looking at profit per support coordinator. They're looking at company profit. So as long as they're making a livable wage and their staff members are compensated appropriately and their participants are cared for, the price guide doesn't matter to them, because in theory, as they get an extra support coordinator, they make that little bit extra profit. They keep their livable wage. They're not building businesses for profit. I think where a lot of these organizations are going wrong is they're looking at, we've built a business for profit. We're in the community sector. The idea was not, we've come from a whole bunch of not-for-profit, and we now have a whole profitable part of this sector. But the people that don't seem to be working towards high profit, they seem to be working towards livability, seem to not be worried. In relation to allied health and support coordination in general, and this is a very broad term I'm going to make, I think it's really weird that you can go do what I would class as a short course and a self-assessment and be paid more than someone that's been to uni for 4 years. So I'm talking about behavior support practitioners in relation to allied health. I think that the pay disparity there is really, really interesting, that positive behavior support practitioners are paid so much higher than other allied health when you've been to uni for many years. I think holistically, the reason the price guide is the way it is quite political, to tell you the truth. I'm not a political person, but we've seen a whole bunch of pressure put on the NDIS around how much they're spending. And I think that's what's leading to this. And I feel like things like support workers have to be privatized out. There is no comparison to other parts, there's no comparison to other parts of the industry like allied health. And if things like allied health and support coordination fall over, in theory, they can suck that back into government systems. And when they suck that back into government systems, it may cost them more, but what they've done is they've saved money on the NDIS, because they go, we've spent this amount of money. Look, what we've done is we've got rid of this, and now we've saved this amount of money. But they're not going to say, well, actually, we've had to put all that money into Medicare and into the private health sector. We've actually had to put more in to float it up, which means that next election, it looks like they've saved vast amounts of money. So I feel like a little bit of this price guide is actually to assist. So the other thing is that I think that there's a huge amount of bureaucracy within the NDIA and a lot of Quality and Safeguards Commission around management of supports organizations. And there's been a big push against them around, you're not managing them, you're not looking in on them, you're not having oversight. But I also believe that it's extremely hard to have oversight when you've got hundreds of thousands of organizations. So if you lower the amount of organizations within the scheme, you lower the amount of management necessary to have oversight. So I was speaking to someone the other day and they're talking about they're trying to set us back 12, 13 years. And then when we actually had a further conversation, I feel like they're trying to set us back 7 years. They're trying to take us back to where we were 7 years ago with the amount of providers we had in the space, because that was a manageable amount of providers. We've now had this massive boom within providers, and it's really, really hard to manage. From a government perspective, it's hard to manage that much privatization. They've never had to do it before. They don't know how to do it. So I feel like this price guide is really about making organizations disappear. And it's so that they can manage the sector better and they can look like they've saved money. That's what I feel like it comes down to. And I also feel that once we get to the next government, that everything will be fine, because I feel like this is a real kind of political, I'm not in any way political, but I feel like this is what it is. It's about showing we can manage these organizations because there's less of them. And if we suck some of that into other services within the government, we can show that we save money.
What you're saying matches a lot of what a lot of people are saying. Thank you for that opinion. I think, like, James, I'm conscious of your time. Thank you so much for spending time hanging out and being willing to share your thoughts with people about what you're seeing. And I'm particularly delighted that you would be real with us about your own battles when you were in your 20s around I'm neurodivergent and mental health and the other things you were facing. I just think, wow, people don't talk like that. They hide that stuff, or they try and make out, oh, that's the previous life, whatever. But what you're saying is, hey, there's 100,000 people in your shoes right now, and they need some support. And that support may not be direct. It may be indirect. So firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge I appreciate your realness. I appreciate that you're serving people by doing that. And I think anyone listening to this is going to be like, I've learned something valuable there. But James, just thank you. Thank you for hanging out. If someone
Thank you for having
in touch with you or your, you're so welcome. Anytime. If someone wanted to get in touch with you or your organization, I mean, you're a CEO of a decent sized organization. How does someone get in touch with you? And why would someone get in touch with you?
People get in touch with me for different reasons. The best way to get in touch with me is via LinkedIn, because it's the only platform that, like, if you text me, I will just look at it, think that I've replied, and it won't happen because it doesn't have a visual. If it doesn't have a face to it, it's not real for me. So if you want to talk to me, contact me via LinkedIn. That's like that for a lot of people. What would people contact me for? If you're struggling at the moment and you just need to talk to someone that isn't going to bill you hundreds of dollars to have the conversation, is just going to be real, reach out. I'm quite happy to have a chat. I don't really have the time to do coffees anymore, but to have a chat about where people are at and how they feel, and I'm happy to do that. If you've got a participant that's really complex, and either as a support coordinator or an allied health professional or another service provider, and you just need to bounce an idea off someone or go, hey, I've hit a wall, let's have that conversation. I call it squash. It's where you sit with someone else and you just both hit shit against the wall and see what happens, and I feel like more of that needs to happen. And that's not about kind of helping, getting referrals or anything like that. It's about, we actually need to help each other within this sector, because we only know what we know. And if, a behavior support practitioner or an OT comes to me and goes, hey, I've got a problem with this, I go, have you thought about it like this? Oh, no, we haven't. Oh, that's cool. And I go the same with my friends that are within the sector in different roles and go, have you thought about this? Oh, no, I haven't. And they go, well, have you tried this, James? I'm like, oh, I never thought about that because I don't understand that. So if they want to reach out to me, LinkedIn is the best place. And yeah, I'll just do a little drop. We service Melbourne and out. We don't service in Melbourne. So if you have someone that's quite complex and would like the skill set and the brain of James, having some oversight on that, reach out. Also, if you just want to have the brain of James in a conversation, I'm up for that as well.
Well, I would want to have the brain of James. Let's be real. Okay, I love it, James. Thank you so much for spending time with us. If anyone can't find James because you forgot his surname is Loveday or whatever, they can find me. Just Google athletic koala. It's not that hard to find because there aren't many athletic koalas, okay? And I'll happily put you in touch with James. he's certainly been a massive resource for me and a massive help to me many times. And I'd recommend him wholeheartedly. Thank you, James, for hanging out with us today.
Peace out, and I'll speak to everyone soon.
Thanks so much.